Our first presenter will tell us about the latest in CPG collaboration and optimization. Joining me now is Joel Cartwright, Industry Principal for Consumer Products at Vistex. Joel, the podium is yours.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity to join everyone today. As John mentioned, my name is Joel Cartwright. I'm the industry principal for consumer products here at Vistex, and actually I run our global industry team. I've been in the consumer packaged goods industry for about 25 plus years. Companies like Sara Lee Foods, Sunny Delight Beverage, and Kimberly-Clark. For the last 15 years or so, I've worked on the software side, trade promotion management, optimization, revenue management software, implementing the software, product management, and support. So it's an interesting topic that I've kind of spoke to you about today, but essentially in essence, what it is, for my entire career, I've worked with a lot of sales organizations and so forth, and around the concept of joint business planning. And what we always thought about is this was essentially a paradigm, but that paradigm of the relationship between a manufacturer and retail, which is retailer buyers, is typically kind of strained at points. And that's been a paradigm which has been created. But however, that paradigm is shifting in relation to the need for some sort of a shared profitability. So what I want to talk about today is really unraveling this paradigm. I'll kind of describe what that is, the paradigm of joint business planning, where it was, where it is, and where it's going. Define some of the players and the responsibilities who are involved in creating this paradigm, and what are the main drivers to changing the paradigm and creating a better joint business planning component. Talk about that, how that change can occur from a journey standpoint. Talk about how digitalization and technology is going to be important in creating this joint business planning capability, and what does success look like. So essentially, joint business planning and a meaningful optimization. It talks about why does a retailer and a CP vendor collaboration consistently prove to be a difficult one to achieve. There's always seems to be this adversarial approach. At least it's been essentially in my relationship with them. First, let's define what we're talking about joint business planning. In essence, this is the annual planning process that CP manufacturer and the retail buyer talks about getting together and say, all right, what's the promotional activity we want to run? What are the price points that we want to do every day versus promoted? What's the category growth you're looking for? Are we looking for top line? Are we looking for bottom line? What is that annual planning? What is that quarterly planning? First half, second half planning? What does that look like? So this is the meeting between the CP manufacturer and the retailer, and creating that relationship and putting together that plan. But again, over the years, there's been created essentially a paradigm. The paradigm is consisted of, there's a tremendous amount of lack of collaboration. And JBP is a collaboration, really meaning between manufacturers and these retailer buyers to discuss these operating plans. They need to include the basic logistics, pricing, result of what has to be transactional perspective, as well as what tactical and strategic things. And there's been a lack of that. More importantly, there's been a lack of trust and transparency. And JBP needs, in order for this to flourish, transparency and an exchange of information that's required by both parties, and understanding what both parties are needing from a business perspective. And it's understanding how we can essentially target that shopper and create a beneficial plan. In this technology space, what we found is that there's really a lack of technology, in essence, to create a structure that needs these technology components to have the right area and starting points to have this collaboration and create this transparency. So technology could be the solution. So let's take a step back. What caused this paradigm? I've been in this space an awful long time. I've called on a lot of retailers like Walmart, Kroger, Home Depot, and so forth. And ultimately, what caused the paradigm is that each side was trying to gain leverage. They were trying to get leverage over the other. They were acquiring and trying to get an advantage to get a better position, better execution from both sides of the table. As the manufacturer, I want a better spot on the shelf. I want a better margin. On the retailer, I want the same thing. I want better margin, and I want to make sure I've got the best customer on my shelves. I'm always positioning for an advantage, trying to gain that advantage, a favorite position, both strategically and competitively. From the manufacturer, strategic against my customer or my competitors, and the retailer, the same thing. Competitive strategic advantage over my competitors, but ultimately too a desired margin goals. So I'm constantly or was constantly moving for position to gain that advantage. So it has started out, has taken the form of adversarial planning. Really, it's a chess match, between the retail and the manufacturer. Who's going to flinch, with category and margin growth ultimately at stake, and ultimately at the consumer's expense. So, at Vistex, because we're in multiple industries, retail, distribution, and consumer products manufacturing, we have the kind of clear view of the entire end-to-end industries as it relates to the consumer and the manufacturer and the retailer. But ultimately, what we found is that the adversarial planning is important. But let me give you my kind of experience with this adversarial planning. I was working for a large meat company here in the state, in the U.S., and specifically in Ohio, and they were selling pork loins. They were selling pork loins to Walmart. So I'm preparing my spreadsheets. I'm getting ready for my meeting with my buyer down at Walmart. I'm putting together all these cost parameters, these Excel spreadsheets are ready to challenge and to say, hey, this is the planning that we want to do from a margin, from an optimization, from a strategic growth, from a category perspective. I was in the office. I was ready. I prepared for this for weeks. The Walmart buyer walked in, said, we're going to buy 2.3 million pounds of pork loins. We're going to pay this per pound. And that was the planning process. So not very much adversarial, really no planning at all. But what's happened is that ability to do that type of planning is really going away due to the constraints and the problems that are occurring within the marketplace. So it's not my first experience, and it's not been my best experience, but that's typically what I've had. So ultimately, in order to solve this, we had to define who are the roles and the players that are involved in this whole process. Historically, it's been the category manager, essentially saying, all right, I'm more interested in the plan execution rather being more strategic for planning for margin growth. So that's kind of the pitfall that the manufacturers are falling in from a category manager perspective. And of course, the retail buyer, similar to their category manager, they're more focused on the vendor participation and execution and keeping their margins whole, really, than to how can we be collaborative. But what we found at Vistex in talking with retailers and manufacturers across from different areas, different regions of the country, or the globe, what we found is the biggest missing component here was the consumer, because they play the biggest role and the key player. And they're typically, historically, were not really thought of as part of a joint strategic plan. They were thought of individually and not really together. So that's what really evolved into this complexity. Revenue growth management became the category. The planning process includes now much more complex shopper insights, or needs to include much more shopper insights, shopper marketing, loyalty, category management, merchandising, sales, and the supply chain of the entire end-to-end process. So this paradigm, the way the paradigm has evolved, it's created this complexity. The retail buyer, looking at their own shopper journey, the planning process, they need to include those shopper insights and shopper marketing. And these are the areas that we need to focus on. These are the areas we identified from from a manufacturer standpoint, from a retailer standpoint. This is what they need: shopper insights, shopper performance, all this sort of e-commerce and data and supply chain data. And what we found when we put the two together, like, hey, these are the same thing. They're both wanting the same thing. Because in essence, what we're trying to do is essentially enhance that customer journey. And there again, the biggest role, and they're at the center, are going to need to be at the center of the strategic plan. So what we found is these two entities are essentially striving for the same thing, but if maybe they worked together, they could essentially solve and improve that shopper journey. So that's important. As I mentioned, these are duplicate goals that they're having. The planning process, including these encompassing areas, including the shoppers, and ultimately trying to get to the end shopper and what that journey looks like. So what we come to is we need to figure out how we bring them together. How can we bring these together to create that shared shopper experience? So most important component is the one is never physically present during these discussions, but they need to be shopper-centric focused in the approach from each side, from the mutual side, to put together a shopper-specific game plan. So essentially, There's no shared purpose at the time. There's no alignment and no collaboration. And that's what we discovered in speaking with our customers. And in essence, it was our customers, the retailers and the manufacturing. And this is the most surprising thing, is that the retailers and the manufacturers came to us with this conclusion. They say, hey, how can we, you're the technology provider, help us figure out how we can work together to contain or to agree and get a shared purpose, get alignment, and get collaboration. And we're saying, okay, that's a great thing, but we just want to understand we have to change this. Everyone is moving forward together. If we all get this moving together the same way, the success will take care of itself. And so that's a great quote from Henry Ford. If everyone is moving forward together, then the success will just take care of itself. So we said, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's take a look at how we can solve for this. Well, then we started to think about, all right, what are the drivers for this? Because we have to solve for this. What is the key drivers for these entities coming forward and saying, we need better joint business planning? And I think it's kind of what you would imagine. There are microeconomic challenges. There's inflation, ultimately high and volatile inflation. And these increase the cost of the raw materials, labor, transportation, all this other things are eroding the profit margin. It's putting pressure on both the retailers and the manufacturers to solve for this. What we're finding and what they're finding is there's only so much they can do. There's only so much they can have, because I cannot continue as a retailer, as a manufacturer, continue to pass off these increases to the consumer. The consumer has achieved a very high price sensitivity. What we found is the consumers are unwilling and simply unable to accept the price increases as it relates to this inflation. And what they're finding from our analysis, our retailers' analysis, and our manufacturers pulling it together and having these discussions is that the consumer is either trading down or they're just leaving the category altogether. So we can no longer just pass along price increases. We can no longer just let the consumer take it. The consumer's walking away. So that's where the joint business planning has evolved. How can we work together to be collaborative to do this? Additionally, the components, what we flushed out was the microeconomic challenges, is the complexity in relation to e-commerce. The growth of e-commerce has created a very complex product customization, product messaging. And really, it's also having that contributing to the price increases and really the problems within the value chain for the consumer. So as the consumer's virtual basket, as a consumer's foot traffic in store, those have become very, very complex. Where do I invest my money? How do I do that? And I can't solve that alone as a manufacturer and as a retailer. So that's the key challenges, is those complexities. And these challenges are always going to be there. They're not going to go away. So again, the continued reinforcement of where joint business planning, that historical paradigm, needs to be solved. You can't solve problems by using that same thinking that we used to create them. That's just not the logic you can have. So change has to occur. And what our clients in the retail and the manufacturing, consumer products manufacturing space have come to the conclusion that the best way to do this and solve this problem is through collaborative planning, being more strategic and working together, and see how technology can do that. So we said, all right, let's go and start solving this. How can we do this?
Joel, before you went on to the solutions, a question came in from one of our attendees. The question is, in your opinion, does retail media planning belong in the joint business planning mix? And what are the implications if it is?
It does belong in the mix, the retail media planning. If we're specific around media as per promotional activity to drive foot traffic in the store, it does. The challenge will be is to how do you apply those cost components again and share that maybe with and understanding how that would be impactful with the manufacturer, or how that can be shared costs is typically what we found. But it does need to be brought into the mix. But how do we look at it from a profitability standpoint? How do we look at it from a simplistic, is this the right way to go, or is this the right type of ad to run? So it's something we're going to have to solve for. We're not sure how we're going to solve for it just as yet, on how the expense can be allocated down.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. That's a great question. So as I talked about, there are some essential requirements that are going to have to occur. There's going to have to be some sort of collaboration. And this is going to be, if you're a retailer or a manufacturer, this is going to be, wow, this is pretty difficult stuff to swallow, because these are some pretty tough things that I would maybe want to share. But collaboration. And that means that the retailer and the brands need to do co-creation of promotions. They need to meet objectives of both the brand retailer and the shopper from the category perspective. The partners need to reach an agreement on these activities together and share in common objectives. And that's the first kind of step in collaboration, setting common objectives. I talked about before, where we want to grow, how do we want to grow, top line, bottom line, profitability, category growth, and so forth. Instead of working one off and see how one complements, you want to see how one can complement the other. Now, this collaboration, the first thing you say, well, I don't know if I want to share that information on growth and profitability and so forth, margin. Do I want to share that? But then you're going to have to. It's going to start to create that requirement of trust through transparency. The partners need to demonstrate they understand the category together, those growth drivers, and then more importantly, each of them together understand the consumer mindset. As I mentioned, partners are going to have to share growth strategies. They're going to have to be showing strategic priorities and strategic challenges. And the word open the kimono kind of comes up all the time. You have to maybe share a little information historically. You may not want to. This, in turn, anytime you want to have an objective, you have to be able to have success metrics to measure against those objectives. So this, in turn, requires some transparent financial, maybe non-financial targets. This may be something that may want to have to ease into. But these are going to have to be relevant KPIs that show responsibilities for each side, who's responsible for what, and coinciding timing. So these are metrics that are going to have to be determined. And then, as I mentioned, partners may have to share information which may be taboo before. So to further establish that trust through transparency, in order to achieve success, you may have to do that. So the collaboration, what does that look like? Shared objective. Essentially, it's very simple. In speaking with our customers, what we found and kind of very quickly flushed out, there has to be some sort of a written plan on both sides that shows the results and the process and who owns what. And there has to be a continual review of that process. These mutual objectives have to be should be opportunities to drive margin or top line growth. They have to be clearly defined and agreed upon initiatives and strategies. Is it a high pressure? Is it better merchandising condition, deal collaboration, deal offerings? What does that look like? More importantly, it's ownership of what is implemented. Who owns what from the objectives? And there have to be milestones set with benefits, including some sort of a return on investment, margin performance, and metrics and all. Because we're going to put a lot of effort into it. We have to turn around and be able to say, yeah, this collaboration, this is the result of it. These are measurable results. And those start with shared objectives, shared collaborative objectives. Creating that trust through transparency, one of the kind of, how do we do trust through transparency? What does that look like? And when the discussions we had come up with some do's and don'ts, don't just go to the retailer or your vendor and start talking all about your brand. Start focusing, because that gives that perception of it's all about you. What you want to do is start saying very simply, this is kind of common sense type of thinking. Let's share our growth strategy. Let's share our strategic priorities, share those challenges, and see how we can work together to meet these challenges. And what can we do? So introducing that trust through transparency on the collaboration. Well, ultimately, I'm guilty of this in my history of working with the retail partners and buyers. I just don't show up with programs that I want to run and just allow to make sure that this is what I want to do, and I don't want to take any sort of input. But you do, so you don't want to come up right out of the gate with this is the plan I want to run. Either side, we want to start with kind of a blank slate. But what you do want to show up, and we hear this resonated. New conversations that we've had with all of our clients in these two spaces is that you have to come with consumer-focused programs. These are both parties having the ability to put collaboration on consumer-focused programs that may be out of the ordinary historically, but really are collaboratively defined to drive success. What does that look like from that perspective? And then the success metrics. These really key success metrics we talked about. And this is data that's not normally shared. What are those KPI measures? Is it top line? Is it profit? Is it margin? Maybe ease into what those metrics would look like. But these metrics, again, I mentioned, may not typically be shared. So you're going to have to, somebody's going to have to give the olive branch forward to say, hey, let's take a look at it from a top line perspective. What are my top line targets, or what are my cost control components? And start to share it from that. That'll start gaining trust. And then shared access to this information with some sort of a common scorecard. This is the messaging that we heard. I have to be able to quickly share this information and be able to have that fluid throughout the discussions, throughout the periods, to allow quick review of it, because with joint reviews, I can then act upon any sort of problems if there is a problem with any sort of execution, the plan is not working. And all these will start creating the trust and transparency for this collaboration capability. So really some sort of way of sharing that information. And these are requiring tools. These are mutual items they're going to have to bring to the table to make this happen. We're going to have to kind of go out of the norm of the non-traditional players and have a cross-functional resources on each side, finance, supply chain, that may have to be involved. We're going to need the concept of consumer and shopper insights. I know this really has a lot of momentum right there on a lot of that data, but start looking at the perspective from both sides. And then understand and sharing, and maybe process sharing, what's your current and long-term growth drivers? And then looking for vendors like ourselves at Vistex, is there applicable technology? And of course, folding in if there are any sort of trends. And this is very interesting. In the industry group, one of the things that we're focused on from a technology standpoint is what are the industry trends that we can bring to the table with technology that can solve these problems. So looking at, from both sides, industry trends that may or may not impact both sides together, may impact both sides or each side individually. And then the relevant intellectual technology property, as well as the shopper data that may or may not both sides have. So there's a lot of tools. Do you need all those? No. But at least these are the areas you can start thinking about. Maybe have 2 or 3 and then start down this process journey in order to get joint business planning rolling. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you got to start thinking, we have to start thinking differently. All the folks we spoke with and of our clients and so forth, saying we have to think differently. The landscape has changed. And it can't be just tactical trade negotiation. It just can't be all about category management, just plain old promotion planning, short-term planning, or just brand focus. Just handle at the buyer or category manager level. It has to be a broader topic. It has to be more broader. We have to think differently. We can't continue to do the same thing because it's not footprint. It needs some sort of collaboration tool that provides a platform of either real-time or near real-time communication and document sharing. And the biggest component too, it's going to need some sort of data integration capability. That's something very much we're focused on at Vistex, is how can we digitalize or apply artificial intelligence on the digitalization and data harmonization processes, because there's multiple sources of data in order to encompass that to get comprehensive analysis. JBP is also going to have to look at a lot of forecasting capability, predictive analytics, to inform and help with the decision-making on both sides. And these are and essentially help with the strategic adjustments. And then the performance tracking, those are the data points that are encompassing all these KPIs, to compare that against the objective and say, hey, how is our plan performing together? Do we need to make course corrections? And that's really where the key technology blueprint or footprint is really going to occur on these 4 key areas. Then the digital JBP, what does that collaboration kind of look like in the initial one? And what we found and what the customers are coming to us for is some sort of a digital dashboard, some sort of JPP and joint business planning dashboard or portal, which will provide the ability for partners to look at data, partners to continuously adjust plan information based on these results, and provide partners the ability to react swiftly to changing market conditions. And that's the one thing too that I think everyone is aware of, is that market conditions have changed very rapidly. Market sentiment, consumer focus, consumer behavior is changing rapidly. So important for technology to help us kind of get ahead of that. But this also can create a paradigm. And this is one thing we had to discuss with our clients. Well, how extensive is this going to be? How big do we want this dashboard? How much ability do we want to go back and forth in order to make this happen? So what we found is this is going to be varying levels based upon the customer, the manufacturer, and the retailer. Because what does that dashboard look like? How collaborative can it be? So the way we're addressing this, it has to be flexible. It has to be able to adjust and adhere. But more importantly, it has to evolve as the capability kind of proves itself out. As I mentioned too, in order for all this to work, data integration and data core integration is really key for collaboration. It's going to enhance all this alignment. It's going to increase efficiency. It's going to help decision making. It's going to streamline all this document sharing. Being in this business, a lot of times in both the technology and the consumer products, probably every industry and across multiple industries, as I mentioned, Vistex is in, one of the biggest key components of pain points is digitalization and harmonization of data. I have multiple external data sources. If I'm a manufacturer, if I'm a retailer, if I'm a distributor, if I'm in life sciences, if I'm in automotive, there are multiple data points that need to harmonize. And encompassing this digital JBP is also evolving as far around as artificial intelligence. How can artificial intelligence play a role? Well, the first component with that will be how I'm going to need to be able to harmonize tremendous amounts of data to do this, to make this happen. But from a digital joint business planning process journey, data integration will be key. Data integration and harmonization of that is the core of the collaboration components that's required. And we knew and that's our focus from a development standpoint. It's our focus as a company, as a technology software manufacturer. We know this is a problem we're solving for. But we know this, again, is a paradigm. I know this kind of sounds silly, but when we put all these great thoughts forward, we have to ask the question, well, because there's a digital JBP in this integration, hey, there's going to be some things we're going to have to overcome. We're going to have to overcome the data silos. There's a lot of data out there, that we need to count, but there's data silos that are difficult to access. The data quality is varying levels, everything from Excel spreadsheets to PDF files, EDI, API transmission. I could go on, different formats. Different inaccuracies, and all that needs to be harmonized. And a lot of it has incomplete data sets. And there's interoperability. There's different technologies, and this is, this sounds kind of strange from a technology person, but there are varying levels of technology capabilities and across the platforms that we talk with. There's no harmonized data platform. Your Microsoft, your SAP, your Oracle, you're all over the board. Your Salesforce, you're talking and working with multiple platforms. And of course, on everybody's Christmas list is to make everything in real time. It's got to be in real time. Got to be in real time. I have to be able to react. Well, that's easier said than done. Real-time data integration is hard, especially when you're harmonizing, gathering all this data. So we have to set the expectation is that, it can be real time on some things, but it may be close to real time on the others. And ultimately, too, when we get the IT folks involved, there's compliance, there's a security, ensuring data privacy, and make sure you're adhering to all these regulations. So anytime we start sharing data and pulling data in, the IT folks and IT security get involved and say, hey, wait a minute, you're talking about a lot of data. As I mentioned, too, in this journey, trust and transparency, in order to make this happen, there's going to have to be a lot of forecasting analytics, and utilizing predictive analytics, artificial intelligence. So because what we're trying to do in joint business planning, one of the big components is to identify and adapt to disruptions and address how to best leverage and how to adapt to these disruptions. The best way to do it is to anticipate them. So if you can anticipate some sort of disruption or shift in the consumer behavior shift somewhere, it's better to get ahead of that and get identified before it happens, or help to identify before it happens, because you can react better, obviously. And that's the way to do that is looking at the partners look at the information together, how they forecast together. They can all get in to help be more strategic and get a jump on these disruptions. And this partner data will have to be combined with data science, predictive analytics, and AI to predict these disruptions. And this all sounds really good, but there's a problem here. It's a lot of information, but more importantly, if you start talking data science and AI, these are complex models that could have varying levels, and they're going to have different forecasting model, and this needs to be crucial to have the model that's accurate, that aligns to both partners' data and fitting the data. So simple models may not really capture and identify these trends. So these models are going to have to be complex. Number one. The third point there is testing. You're constantly going to have to be testing these market conditions. Of course, that's where AI can come in and help with the market testing, help with the condition testing, and to encompass those rapid shifts in the market dynamics. And of course, as we talked about, there's a lot of external factors impacting. There may be external factors that may be impacting only just a single partner. And how do we overcome that? The economic challenge or global events may introduce unpredictability for just the retailer or just the manufacturer. We don't know. And how do you react to those? Or how do that gets encompassed into the models and so forth and the predictive capability? So it's, again, one of those paradigms. With the last component, too, related to joint business planning, what I've been talking about are these success metrics. And in going through this journey with a lot of folks and discussing this, you would think, these would be the most difficult ones, but at the end of the day, these are kind of one of the easiest ones. These are basic revenue growth measures, comparing to an objective that you'd agree. Is it top line? Is it for a specific period? Is it market share? Is it profitability? They're very basic periods. And what we discussed and came to the conclusion that each manufacturer and retailer and distributor told us that I don't need a whole slew or a whole group of KPIs, a whole large component. More is not necessarily better. I need 4 or 5 basic KPI metrics that each side understands very clearly, that relate back to an objective that will help me successfully manage a business. So defining those success metrics are basically very important. The only paradigm I saw around this in talking about metrics was really the finger pointing aspect. If something wasn't being delivered against the objective, somebody has to be to blame. So that's a discussion that's going to be difficult to have. Hey, we're not getting the in-store execution, that's why it's not working. Or the manufacturer didn't tell me about a supply chain interruption, they got shorted product. Those are the type of things that when we start looking at these combined success metrics, we have to start to make this decision of somebody's going to have to be at fault and somebody has to take accountability for that. So that's can be a difficult conversation to have, but as long as there's trust, transparency, and collaboration, makes those discussions essentially that much more easier. So lastly, who owns all this? That was the biggest thing too, is when we went through all this and I captured all this information, I had all these discussions my team did with these components. Who owns this? And we're saying, well, retailers, do they want to own it? Because there's a pretty good investment here. Do manufacturers, do they want to own it? So they're not, retailers like, well, not all my vendors may want to use this. Do I want to put this type of investment in this data? Or the manufacturers saying, well, not all my customers are going to want to use this. Not all my customers want to use the portal or anything I put together. So the paradigm here gets created is who basically owns it? Who's going to step forward with a technology investment to make this occur? Now, what we were able to say is that, and determine that we can show you the success metric. We can basically show you how this works and how it could work, and then establish that with the investment, what that return on investment could look like when you apply both these metrics together. But essentially, when discussion with these others, that we see where you're going, and we see, yes, there definitely will be, I shouldn't say could be, there will be a return on investment. So that is really important. So this is a big development effort for us. We're working very closely with our customers and our retailers. It's starting with a lot of conversion capabilities as relates to periods and harmonizing data entry, displays, calendars, visualizations, data flow, data controls. These are a lot of factors from a technology standpoint that we as a provider are looking into and solving for, in our joint business planning development epic, because this is an epic. This is a cross-industry collaboration that harmonizing essentially a business plan across 2 entities and multiple entities that has to be essentially tailored, but yet still one size fits all. So this is what we're working on. They've done a lot of success on solving for this and getting ready to roll this out. So achieving success, this is the most important thing. As I mentioned, the first thing is say, hey, this is a big investment. Am I going to get some sort of return on investment here? So achieving success was really important in what that looks like. So the successful joint business planning involves, as I mentioned, I've said it before, I've said it many times on this presentation, is that involves collaboration. They need to achieve, through mutually agreed upon goals against objectives to drive this type of growth, to solve these macroeconomic challenges. And these are the key success to make this happen. You have to have clear objectives. When you're sitting down together and collaborating, one of the first things we spoke about and one of the things we solve for in speaking with these manufacturers and these retailers, we have to have very clear objectives that are shared objectives. And they're basically align these shared goals and outcomes. They align on the key performance indicators that will measure against those objectives. So everybody is on the same page and clear, this is what we want to achieve, and this is what we want to do, and how we want to measure it. Most importantly, I know this sounds crazy and silly, but you really have to have effective communications and establish regular communication channels. I know I've worked for manufacturers where I only met with a buyer once a year, or even have many conversations once a quarter. So really need to establish some sort of regular communication channels. What does that look like? Is that through the portal? Is that through the basic email exchange? But more importantly, where we see that is that insights on the dashboard. That creates that data transparency, that shared communication to foster that trust and enhance that effective communication. I think when you first sat down, one of the things we said, well, we're going to have to come up with some sort of, you're talking about collaboration, you're talking about trust and so forth, but you got to come up with an overall collaboration strategy. What's that look like? We don't want to go into this blind. And I was talking about, as I said, the roles and players have changed. You want to involve all the key stakeholders in the planning process. But also more importantly, and I know I come from the technology side, leverage, that your vendor partners, your technology partners, but leverage each other's strengths. Manufacturers, where's your strength lies relates to the consumer, or something like that. Sharing that, hey, we're really good at this, or we're really good at that. Sharing those strengths and those resources will help in develop this collaboration strategy and collaboration overall. So want to create two, action plans. These are really the key success. Create detailed action plans, timelines. From a joint business planning, we want to have this in place on this date and this date to be effective for the coming year. But you also want to make sure don't be too rigid with these action plans. You need to have some sort of a flexibility from a responsibility timeline standpoint, is because there are changing market conditions. But more importantly, back to the communication, you need to have those regularly scheduled check-ins to assess how the joint business plan is performing. And that those sessions adjust strategies, change directions if need be, make course corrections, or identify opportunities based upon the performance, the data, and the feedback that you're getting from the overall dashboard, the technology, and what the consumers are saying. So that's important. But ultimately, too, there's a mutual commitment that has to occur. And all these sessions, all these discussions that in between our manufacturers and the retailers I've seen a mutual commitment really evolve. And what that does, having these discussions and identifying these clear directions that need to occur, it really fostered a culture of collaboration and accountability and a commitment for all these parties to recognize that there is a problem and celebrate when there's going to be success. And that helps strengthen this overall partnership. So really fostering and working on that mutual commitment is important. So joint business planning is a main focus for us. It's a main component that we're working on. And again, we're hearing from it from multiple industries, but most importantly, from the consumer products and retailer perspective. So my name's Joel Cartwright. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. But I don't know if we have time, John. We'll turn it back to you and see if you have any questions in the portal.
Yeah, a couple came in, Joel. The first one, is the recent attention being paid to joint business planning coming from retailers or manufacturers?
That's a great question. And where it started, and surprisingly enough, on the retailer side. The retailers were kind of giving that olive branch, the retailers whom we work with, and because they were saying, hey, because it started with us. They were saying, hey, Vistex, you work with a lot of manufacturers. Help us kind of bridge that or extend that olive branch to the manufacturers. And surprisingly, The manufacturer, they said, yeah, we were trying to figure out how we could do that. But it really was initially started on the retailer side. And again, I said that's really surprising based on my background with manufacturing.
Okay, well, this is my question. Who do you think would own the overall capability, retailers or manufacturers?
Ultimately, the best suited for this would essentially be the retailers who would own this. I think it would be better suited from their perspective. However, the investment would have to be a shared investment with the manufacturers, but ultimately the retailers would typically would have to own this, and ultimately that's really driven by the sheer number of vendors that they would have to work with. And I think in order for that to be successful and display the fact that they would essentially own it. And own it's really a hard term. Essentially, own it. They would kind of maybe be the leader of it. Hey, we think this portal is really good. We'd like you to work on it. So maybe own it's not the best word, but maybe lead it or be the thought leader in it would be better said.
Okay, last question. From a technology standpoint, where do you see the biggest obstacle on delivering a solution?
Two key areas, as I mentioned, was the external data points in the different silos and the different requirements for harmonization, incomplete data. So really external data source, digitalizing that and harmonizing that. On the second point, a big obstacle is on each side of the table, the partner, the retailer and the manufacturer, and their internal IT ecosystem. Is that IT ecosystem that we're having to work with in order to make this work? Are they all talking together? Are they cohesive? Is it a clean core that would be best suited to make this happen? So two key areas in the external data and getting that data, harmonizing it and getting into a data pool that can help with the forecasting, the analytics and so forth. But ultimately, two, the individual IT ecosystem that is in on each side of the table, is that at a point where it's communicating together and cohesive enough to make all this work? Good questions.
Okay, Joel, that's all the questions we have coming in. If you want to keep the conversation going, attendees, you can reach out to Joel. His email is on the screen, joel.cartwright@vistex.com. Again, Joel, that was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Have a great rest of your afternoon.